The history of railways is bound up inexorably with the history of the steam engine. The invention of the self-propelled steam locomotive gave the impetus to develop railways from the crude tramways at the beginning of the 19th century. Exploitation of the new form of transport was to open up the country, until by the end of the century, virtually all parts were served by rail, which was itself served by steam. The first part of the 20th century was to see consolidation by the railway companies, the first decade being regarded by many as the golden age of steam. The Edwardian locomotives were the epitome of sophisticated transport and were paraded in splendidly elaborate liveries. The next decade was to see everything turned on its head by the First World War, in which the development of both cars and planes were enormously accelerated. The railways were the backbone of the nation's transport needs during that war, but emerged scarred and bruised. The 1920s were to see them consolidated and back on the road to recovery. But the 30s were to be a mixture of depression and hope. All hope died, however, as the 30s came to an end and Europe was once again plunged into conflict. The railways battened down the hatches and prepared for a period of austerity. Away went the cracked streamliners, never to return, and freight traffic soon assumed paramount importance. The 1940s had begun. Austerity was to be the key word in the early 1940s. It was to be applied to those steam locomotives built to the order of the War Department, mass production of which commenced in 1942. These 280s were a development of the Stanier 8F class, many of which were built at the beginning of the war for general use on Britain's railways. The austerities were designed for short-term use at minimum cost and had anticipated lives of just 2 years. They were intended for use overseas, and 935 were built by the end of the war. In addition, large numbers of 060 saddle tanks were built to ministry order, based on a standard Hunslet industrial design. Many of these engines would be sold into private ownership after the war, including a number to the LNER, from which they passed into British Railways ownership as Class J94. The military had been involved with railways from the earliest days. Despite the apparent inflexibility of a railway system, it was unrivaled for mass transportation of troops and equipment. An army operating on foreign soil needed to take over the railways in former enemy territory, so it required troops trained in railway techniques. To this end, the army had set up a special Railway Operating Division, or ROD. In 1905, it had decided to extend the London and South Western Railway's Borden branch in rural Hampshire to its training camp at Longmoor, which acted as a training program in railway construction. By the beginning of the First World War, the Wooler Instructional Railway, as it was then known, was also used for training for railway operation. But after that war, it was run down. In the 1930s, the railway's name was changed to the Longmoor Military Railway and rehabilitated, so that at the start of our decade, with the course of the Second World War already at its worst for Britain, it was an essential part of the Army's training program. During the build-up to the D-Day landings, many of the austerities were loaned to Britain's mainline railway companies, and all but 3 were to be shipped abroad. 735 returned, 2 being retained by the Army at Longmoor. 108 were stored, and the rest again loaned to the home railways. The LNER bought 200, which they classified 07, the others going to the Southern and, as seen here at Warwick and Leamington, the Great Western. In 1948, the newly formed British Railways bought the remaining 533. The formation of British Railways was the second traumatic event to afflict the railways of Great Britain in the 1940s. At first, there was no evidence of change, and the railways looked much as they did before the war. But British Railways was to bring about the end of the steam railway as we knew it. We are engaged on a journey from Moreton-in-Marsh to Leamington Spa and Hatton via Kingham and Banbury, which includes a stretch of railway which we have seen from the line side in the previous programmes in this series. British Railways was to rebuild Banbury Station, at which we see a hall and a castle of the Great Western, implementing a pre-war plan that had already seen Leamington rebuilt. There was an enormous backlog of maintenance and modernisation for the new organisation to implement, and it meant that the steam railway was to change forever. Track, signalling, stations, locomotives and stock had all seen their lives extended beyond normal expectancy, as during the war years the government had assumed overall control. The great railway companies needed to raise enormous amounts of capital to remedy the situation, but the post-war Labour administration was committed to nationalisation. The first clouds had already appeared before the war as various railways experimented with alternative forms of motive power, most notably the LMS with its pioneering diesel shunters and the Great Western with a fleet of diesel rail cars. It was the latter that presaged the wholesale changes that were to come under British Railways, so it's perhaps appropriate that we are looking back at the railway infrastructure of the steam era from one of these diesel rail cars. This is Southam Road and Harbury Station, after which we pass through the short Harbury Tunnel. This line had traffic from all the four pre-nationalisation railways, and as we pass through the refuge sidings at Foss Road, we see an LMS Stanier 8F280, the original class chosen for mass production during the war, and the basis for the Austerity 280 design. We're now passing through Whitnash Cutting, shortly after which the Great Western carriage sidings and loco shed at Leamington appear on our left. A quick glimpse of the one locomotive on shed precedes a view of a freight on the LMS lines. Finally, another freight, with a Churchwood Mogul at the head, leads us to Leamington Station and a couple of the rail cars, ours leaving the station and another with a trailer to the west of Leamington. The products of the Great Western modernisation scheme of the 30s are much in evidence here. Western steam development came to an end with the Hawkesworth Counties, the only new passenger class produced in the 40s before nationalisation. 3 new pannier classes were designed, but 2 didn't appear until after the GWR was no more. Yet more castles were ordered, 10 being delivered before and 30 after nationalisation, the latter with a flat-sided Hawkesworth tender. At the western end of Leamington Spa Station, a grange approaches. The 80 members of this class were built in the 30s, and it was expected that more would appear, replacing older Moguls, but the programme wasn't reinstated after the war. During the war, locomotives were painted plain black, and the Great Western used its initials to designate ownership in lieu of the more elaborate pre-war styles. But after the war, on passenger classes, the G and W were used either side of the company's coat of arms, whilst British Railways was spelt out in full in 1948, as seen on this king, leaving Leamington, heading towards Birmingham. Comparison with the earlier programmes in this series will show the differences in the rebuilt Leamington Spa Station, most notably the revised canopies. As a castle draws in from the north, LNWR signals in the background designate where the LMS lines ran behind the GWR, by now all part of one nationalised railway. The castle also displays the legend fully spelt out on its tender. The coaching stock displays a variety of liveries, both chocolate and cream and plain chocolate, a legacy of the war. One castle continued to sport the GWR coat of arms after 1948 on its centre splashes. The very last express passenger engine built for the company was 7007 Ogmore Castle, which was renamed Great Western in January 1948. The post-war castles were the final GWR express passenger locomotives. This really emphasized both the remarkable advances made by Churchwood at the beginning of the century, since they were really reboilered stars, and the stagnation in GWR design since the 1920s. Similarly, the building of another Churchwood design, the large prairies, continued after the war. 40 were added between 1946 and 1949. More signs of changing times are the colour light signal, although it is of Great Western 1930s design, and the British Railways totem on the tender of the next king on an up express. The first livery for express passenger locomotives on BR was a mid-blue, applied from 1949 to the Kings, the only GWR locomotive so adorned. One batch of the new prairies was turned out in green with British Railways in a distinctly GWR style, but the remainder were painted in the mixed traffic livery of black, lined out in LNWR style. Goods engines were plain black. However, the famous locomotive livery of the GWR was to last to the end of steam on Britain's railways. This King displays the final GWR variation of its Brunswick green, which it had used on locomotives from the Kings to the humblest panniers. This was adopted for all express locomotives of British Railways, except for the 8Ps, and even for them later. Coaching stock livery was red, enlivened with a cream band on mainline stock, known as blood and custard. Halls were built during every year of the war except the last. By April 1943, there were 259 of them, after which Hawksworth modified the design, adding 22 to the class before the 31st of December 1947, and another 26 by the end of the decade. Even then, Swindon still had another 23 to build, but had finished the prairies. It's curious that the Kings were to remain the last design of GWR express locomotives, but Hawksworth, who had taken over as CME from Collett in 1941, has been credited with a proposal for a GWR Pacific, although he himself dismissed the idea as a draftsman's dream. The Churchwood Saints were getting distinctly long in the tooth by the end of the war. Although the great majority survived to the end, the Halls were to see the end of these redoubtable machines, their withdrawals coinciding with the introduction of the new builds of the latter. Similarly, the old open cab panniers were replaced by the new classes. It's easy to see that the Great Western Standardization Scheme was a rolling program of replacement, with like replacing like, albeit updated in the light of experience. The use of Halls to replace the earlier Saints was probably the best example, since they shared the same boilers. The only significant change was the smaller 6-foot driving wheel diameter. The Grangers were an extension of this family with 5-foot 8-inch drivers, effectively replacing the Moguls as well. But latter-day commentators have noted that there was no real improvement in the basic concept from Churchwood's time. Another King, number 6017, calls at Leamington. It bears its number on a new plate on the smokebox door, but has no ownership displayed on its tender. This was the style for a short while, as supplies of the new BR Cycling Lion were awaited. The Great Western's amazing continuity was once again displayed under British Railways, as GWR locomotives retained their numbers, whilst all other railways had extra numbers added. This was probably because of the GWR's use of cast number plates on the cab sides and the expense of changing so many, but it meant that some engines, such as the early large prairies, retained their original numbers for nigh on half a century, from construction to scrapping. In later years, these cast number plates would become collector's items, and many still exist today. Similarly, the brass nameplates borne by many Great Western locomotives have achieved great value. Leaving Leamington now, we briefly visit Whitnash Cutting to the east, where a ballast train is gently drifting towards the town before another king attacks the climb to Parbury with a London express. The coaches are entirely of Great Western design, as British Railways didn't produce any new designs in the 1940s, construction of original company designs being continued. Except for the change of ownership on the tender and the new liveries on kings and coaches, there was little to show that the Great Western had finally vanished after over a century of existence. The longest-lived main-line British Railway. The classic outline, honed by Churchwood at the turn of the century, applied to most locomotives, from freight tanks and tender engines to the mighty kings, to such an extent that its detractors dismissed them, saying, "All Great Western engines look the same." This was surely as much a compliment as an insult, as it summed up the efficient standardization policy which had given the GWR such a strong public image, which has survived intact even today. We are now at Warwick in 1949, the second year of nationalisation, with little to show for it. A manor, one of the pre-war variety, backs a freight into the upholding siding and a light saint reverses past. An additional series of 10 manors was ordered this year as part of British Railways' continuity programme. They would be delivered in 1950. The sense of déjà vu continues as a star races through with an express. Although withdrawals of these early four-cylinder engines had started in the 30s, they had been saved by the war, and only 2 more went before nationalisation, 1 more in 1948 and 3 in 1949. Not only stars were replaced, pannier construction, even of the conventional 5700 variety, continued throughout the decade. Indeed, every year except 1932, from 1930 to 1950, saw new members of the class. One product of the war was an ill-considered government scheme to equip a number of steam locomotives to burn fuel oil instead of coal, including this hall, whose oil tank is seen on the tender. 11 halls, 5 castles, and 20 heavy freight 280s received the equipment in 1946 and 47, which was a result of post-war coal shortage. However, the price of oil rapidly escalated, and the scheme was aborted, the locomotives all reverting to coal firing by 1950. Post-war schedules gradually reverted to pre-war timings, but the GWR's Birmingham expresses didn't regain their full complement of kings at first. Wolverhampton had been reduced to 4 examples in 1947, although by the end of the decade it reached its highest allocation, 7. The useful do-anything halls tended to dominate local services, which had been less affected by the war. However, enormous arrears of maintenance had built up during the conflict and were still plaguing the railways when British Railways took over. Frequent ballast trains attest to the reconstruction still going on. One of the promises the post-war Labour administration made when introducing nationalisation was easy access to state funds. This would, it was argued, enable the railways to make good the damage done and to invest for the future, and in particular electrify the main lines. But no sooner was the Nationalisation Act approved than post-war austerity was tightened as the United States called in its debts and funds dried up entirely. Thus, the fundamental benefit of nationalisation was turned on its head, becoming a burden from which the railways would never truly recover. However, to lovers of steam, this was a benefit, as the cash-straitened BR had to adopt a policy of continued steam construction well into the 1950s. The last 20 castles were British Railways engines. Even a few bulldogs, with their roots in the 19th century, would survive into the second half of the 20th century. The railway with the closest ties to the military was the Southern. So we start in the Aldershot district, where the white bands on the lamp standards remind us of the blackout, at North Camp Station on one of the interregional trains. A pair of Mansell's celebrated Schools Class 440s are the first southern locomotives we see, changing engines at Redhill, where the train reversed. The schools, with narrow cabs, could go on most parts of the system, although their heavy axle loading precluded them from the more lightly laid lines. The schools are followed by a Brighton tank, and one of Mansell's previous 440 design, an L1, backing onto the train at Brighton Station. The Southern's Brighton main line had been the first electrified main line in the country, part of the Southern's intended wholesale electrification policy, which had seen steam development severely curtailed. Note the two numbers on the front of the L1, 30,000 being added to Southern Railway numbers by British Railways, the 10 and 20,000 series being reserved for diesel and electric locomotives respectively. The Southern contributed locomotives in both these categories to British Railways. Never one of the wealthier railways, the Southern had extended electrification by using electric units rebuilt from older steam stock, such as these coaches being shunted by the LBSCR 044 tank of Class D1. Curiously, history was to result in the Southern's principal main line from Waterloo to Weymouth becoming the last steam main line of all. A Mansell King Arthur and a Drummond L12, both natives of the line, are followed by one of the byproducts of the Brighton electrification, an N15X 460. These handsome machines were the Brighton's last express passenger engines, built as 464 Baltic tanks. Made redundant in 1933, they were rebuilt as 460 tender engines for use alongside the King Arthurs on the Southwestern Division. They were reclassified N15X in the vain hope that they would match the Arthurs. Mansell's own large 460s, the Nelsons, had been rebuilt by his successor, Bulleid, whose own remarkable Pacifics burst upon the scene in 1941. The locomotive is a merchant navy, and the train is the Down Bournemouth Belle. The first 10 merchants were built in the darkest days of the war, apparently contrary to all government directives to build only locomotives suitable for the war effort. Bulleid claimed they were mixed traffic engines and built 10 more in 1945, during which year the first of a smaller version, the so-called Light Pacifics of the West Country class, appeared. This one has an Up West of England express. Mansell's Moguls were the real mixed traffic engines of the Southern. This U-class displays British Railways in full on its tender, in the Southern's sunshine lettering, a style introduced by Bulleid, who was nothing if not a publicist. The war had slowed the Southern's electrification plans, which would have seen the replacement of the elderly pre-grouping 440s by electrics, which gave Bulleid the opportunity to produce his Pacifics to fill the gap. There was no denying that Mansell's Lord Nelsons needed replacement on the top services, even after Bulleid had modified them with new cylinders and blast pipes, but the requirement for 140 Pacifics was never proven. It became something of a legend that they were used on one-coach trains in the West Country, especially on the Padstow line. By comparison with other railways, the Southern had little freight and few dedicated freight engines. The Bulleid Pacifics were never seen on regular freight duties, for which they were entirely unsuitable, whatever Bulleid said. The air-smoothed casing, not streamlining, was designed for cleaning in a carriage washer, although once again there seems little evidence that they ever went near one. They were probably twice as powerful as the engines they supposedly replaced, which included Drummond's various 440s and his famous paddle box 460s, one of which is seen here on a rare working day. Basingstoke was an important railway crossroads. Not only was it the effective junction for the Bournemouth and West of England main lines, but a cross-country line connected it to Reading and the Western. These are Bournemouth to Waterloo line trains, designated by the white discs displayed at the front of the locomotive. The southern region of British Railways, as the Southern Railway became, continued the use of head code discs to the end of steam. The single disc on this Class H15 chonker indicates a direct train from Southampton Terminus to Waterloo, and one over each buffer signifies an interregional train to Reading and the Western. The system was also adopted for use with electric stock, using a 2-digit code, which remains in use today. The Mansell Moguls were used on locals on the main line, which was quadruple track from here to the terminus at Waterloo. Expresses used the 2 centre roads, depicted here by an up West of England express headed by one of the wartime merchant navies. The most famous West of England train was the Atlantic Coast Express, which follows an up Salisbury stopper behind a West Country. During the summer months, and especially on summer Saturdays, there seemed to be an unending succession of Atlantic Coast Expresses. The 3rd and 4th coaches are a pair of Bulleid's tavern cars, which became more notorious than his locomotives. The tavern cars themselves were designed to look like a traditional English pub inside, and the restaurant cars, tavern trailers, had very small windows, to which the passengers took an instant dislike. They were rebuilt. Ten more merchant navies were built after nationalisation, most of which ran on the Western Division. 3 were posted to the Eastern Division for use on the cross-channel boat trains, where they supplanted the Lord Nelsons. This Drummond L12 had also worked on the Eastern Division before the war, whilst this is one of Mansell's 10 original King Arthurs, often used on through trains to the Western. They were shedded at Salisbury. Great Western Halls were also familiar on through trains to Reading, but this one has LSWR non-corridor local stock. There now follows the pièce de résistance of our visit, the Devon Bell. This short-lived all-Pullman train only ran from 1947 to 1954. Its most notable feature was the specially built observation car at the back, 2 of which were built. Another interregional train enters Basingstoke behind a Lord Nelson, and our cameraman joins it to go home. However, he returned later in the year to record another interregional train, this time behind an N15 or Uri Arthur. The GWR coaches have received a coat of blood and custard, unlike the southern stock behind a classmate on an up West of England extra which passes non-stop. Basingstoke Shed provides the backdrop as a new Battle of Britain approaches from Bournemouth. Bulleid coaches are being shunted by another Uri Arthur, which sports the new GWR-derived Brunswick green livery for secondary passenger locomotives. The same livery was applied to Nelson's and the Bulleid Pacifics. Only Class 8P express engines received the blue livery. A Drummond S11 440 in post-war filth livery, as is an earlier T9, represents the old order. They await the passage of another of Mansell's Southern Railway updates of the Uri N15s, the real King Arthurs. The first 10 members of this class boasted Uri cabs and remained on LSWR metals, as these fouled the loading gauge on other parts of the Southern. The remainder had cabs like this Mogul on a stopper from Salisbury. It boasts mixed traffic livery, black with LNWR lining, a livery which was also applied somewhat inappropriately to the express passenger schools, one of which precedes our last view of an N15X. Nationalisation was to create regions in lieu of the old companies. The LMS and LNER's Scottish interests were merged to form a single region of British Railways, the Scottish region. This is an ex-Highland Railway and LMS Clan 460, seen at the remote Highland terminus of the Kyle of Loch Arch, just before nationalisation. Only one survived long enough to receive its British Railways number 54767. LMS engines had 40,000 added to their numbers by British Railways, And as they had a 10,000 series already, ex-LMS locomotives filled the number range from 40001 to 59999. The 10,000s had been used for Lancashire and Yorkshire, Furness and Scottish engines. There was also a series of 20,000s, the duplicate list for LNWR and Midland designs renumbered to make way for LMS standard classes. These included the last of the Webb cauliflower goods engines, which were eking out their last days on the northwestern frontier, the former Penrith, Keswick and Cockermouth Railway in Cumberland. The duplicates were to be renumbered once again, using vacant numbers in the 40 and 50,000 ranges. Further south, the Black Country was to be the last territory for Webb's passenger tank classes, whose progress we have followed in this series. Despite the goods work on which we see it engaged, 6922 was one of the passenger-designated Watford tanks, originally designed for suburban duties in the London area. Some of the Watford tanks had been duplicated in the 30s, and many had been withdrawn before the war gave the remainder a stay of execution. However, only 2 were to receive their full British Railways numbers in the 40,000 series, although retaining the LMS letters on the tank sides. Also seen is one of the Webb 242 tanks. The war also meant that a few LNWR express locomotives survived to the dawn of the nationalised railway. Queen of the Belgians was one of just 4 of the Prince of Wales class to achieve this distinction. As we've seen, in the 30s the LMS had embarked on a programme of scrap and build, which had seen the replacement of all the LNWR 440s and 460s by modern 460s. This engine's original number having been allocated to a Jubilee. The 4 Princes, 1 Clawton, 3 George V's, 1 Precursor and 3 19-inch goods were all that remained on the 1st of January 1948 out of a total of 871 440s and 460s bequeathed to the LMS in 1923. Scots, Patriots, Jubilees and Black Fives had replaced them. But even those successors were undergoing changes. The Scots proved very successful, but as they grew older, some design weaknesses became apparent. However, they were successful enough to be used as the basis for a second division of express locomotives, which was to be filled by the Patriots and Jubilees, which were effectively Scots with smaller boilers. All were classified 5XP. The first attempt at the lower powered type had been the 4P Midland compounds, but these couldn't be updated to 5XP status, so they were left to work out their days unaltered. The Jubilees were the ultimate expression of the modern 5XP 460 type, and there was a large gap between them and the 7P Pacifics. The 6P Royal Scots were no longer modern, although they were comparatively new. In 1935, Stanier had rebuilt the experimental high-pressure boiler Royal Scot, number 6399 Fury, with a tapered boiler, larger than that on the Jubilees. This engine had proved to be a fine performer, and was to be used as the basis of modernising the Scots, as and when their boilers, by now the only original Fowler-inspired part of the locomotives left, fell due for renewal. The rebuilding of the Scots didn't actually start until 1943, in the middle of the war. It was preceded by the modification of 2 Jubilees, which were thereby uprated from Class 5XP to Class 6P in 1942. It appears that spare boilers were needed for the Jubilees, so it made sense to use the new type of boiler planned for the Scots on a pair of Jubilees, thus releasing their original boilers for the rest of the class. It was originally intended to rebuild 20 of the Scots, although the official term was renewal. The new boiler was lighter than that which it replaced, and the work entailed the replacement of frames and cylinders as well, so they were really new engines. Part of the intention was to create a Class 6P which could work on the Midland Division which was banned to Pacifics. The Pacifics continue to be the top-link express passenger design on the old LNWR and Caledonian main lines. The Duchess class was expanded to 38 examples during the decade. 13 were built during the war and 2 afterwards. This is one of the later non-streamlined members of the class, seen in 1948 just outside Rugby. The rebuilding of the Scots was a long, drawn-out affair, since some of the boilers were only a few years old, and the rebuilding of the first members of the class released a large pool of spare boilers. Although there had been trouble with drifting smoke on the original type, the rebuilds were initially released without smoke deflectors, but their double chimneys resulted in a less fierce blast when compared to single chimney engines such as the Jubilees, which never required deflectors. By the end of the war, it had been decided that all the Scots were to be rebuilt, together with 18 Patriots. The latter, originally a variation of the Royal Scot design with a smaller boiler, were designated Class 5XP, like the Jubilees. There were 71 Scots, including the rebuilt Fury. 2 Jubilees had already been rebuilt. A study was undertaken to ascertain the requirement for 6p power after the war, and it was decided 91 were needed. Therefore, 18 more were required. The Patriots were experiencing the same faults with their boilers as had the Scots, and since rebuilding rather than new construction was preferred, it was logical to rebuild them rather than the more modern and less trouble-prone Jubilees. The rebuilding of the Patriots would increase the stock of 6Ps, since they were upgraded from 5XP, whilst the original Scots were already 6Ps. Therefore the Patriots took priority, slowing down the Scot programme and leaving a number of the latter to be dealt with by British Railways. There was no requirement to rebuild any more Jubilees, which were to remain unchanged thereafter, as the principal Class 5XP type, supplemented by 34 unrebuilt Patriots. The last Scots were not to be converted until the 1950s, the programme having slowed once British Railways took over. 18 remained in the form seen here by the end of the 1940s, by which time they were reclassified 7p, whilst the 5XPs became 6Ps. The rebuilding of the Royal Scots was effectively the final chapter in the story of LMS Express passenger locomotive development, as the continuation under British Railways was concentrated on mixed traffic types. The British Railways standard range of steam locomotives, with a single exception, were 2-cylinder machines designed as stopgaps pending electrification, so the rebuilds completed the express requirements. However, the very last chapter in LMS steam locomotive development was the replacement of the elderly pre-grouping passenger tanks of the LNWR and Midland Railway by modern machines, again a product of the war, as they would probably have been superseded by diesel rail cars had the conflict not put rail technology back 15 years. Only mixed traffic and freight would see further development. The rebuilt Scots were to feature in the opening scenes of that final chapter, being compared to locomotives such as the illustrious A4s, as the newly formed British Railways instituted a series of locomotive exchange trials in 1948. Locomotives of each of the Big Four were tried out under controlled conditions on each other's main lines in 4 categories: express passenger, secondary passenger, mixed traffic and freight. Black 5s represented the LMS for mixed traffic and were effectively to be adopted as a BR standard. The inclusion of the Scots was a testament to the success of the rebuilding, as they were compared to the 8p Pacifics and GWR Kings, their performance being better than the latter and equal to the Pacifics. The most obvious result of the formation of British Railways was the application of new liveries, including a light green on some of the rebuilt Patriots and plum and spilt milk on coaches. Neither was repeated, but the use of blue on express engines, after an experimental dark blue on some Duchesses, was adopted as standard for Class 8P machines. Mixed traffic and light passenger engines were to receive a coat of black lined out in LNWR style, whilst the secondary express engines of classes 6P and 7P were to receive GWR style Brunswick green. All other engines, such as the Super D on the old LNWR Rugby weed control train, were painted black under BR. Rugby was the location for the first permanent British locomotive testing plant, a project built as a joint venture after the war. It's perhaps appropriate to see one of Sir Nigel Gresley's magnificent A4s here during the locomotive exchanges, as the test plant was his inspiration. The A4 is number 60034, the last one built, still painted in LNER garter blue, but bearing the legend British Railways on the tender. It had just had its name changed from Peregrine to Lord Farringdon. Another A4, number 60007, Sir Nigel Gresley, was to trace its steps a few months later, to appear here when the testing station was opened in October 1948. After another rebuilt Scott has passed, we look back at the station to see the last LMS Streamliner 46243 City of Lancaster in filthy wartime black livery. This was the only one to receive its BR number, as all were defrocked between 1946 and 1948, even though some had been constructed as Streamliners as late as 1943. Note that its tender has already been partially de-streamlined. LMS post-war construction included many experimental versions of the Black Fives, although conventional members of the class were built from 1943 onwards. The Princess Royals remained unchanged, so the rebuilding program of 18 Patriots was the major addition to Top-Link Express power after the war. The difference in the size of the Class 7 and Class 5 boilers is well seen here as a Scott leaves Rugby alongside a Black 5. On the freight side, the war resulted in the mass production of heavy freight engines, and many small locomotives had their lives extended, especially on the Midland Division. The pre-grouping 060 type had been perpetuated by the LMS Standard 4Fs under both the Fowler and Stanier regimes. The final batch was built as late as 1941. Wartime construction of the Stanier 8Fs increased their numbers to 719 in LMS ownership at nationalisation, to which British Railways added a further 39, which allowed a start to be made on the withdrawal of some of the pre-grouping engines, but not yet the Super Ds. By the end of the decade, the LMS had over 1,400 8-coupled freight locomotives. The Crabs continue to fulfill a mixed traffic function and illustrate well the British Railways mixed traffic livery of black with LNWR style red, grey and white lining. Freight engines were plain black, a colour already carried by most of them. All British Railways engines were to be fitted with LMS-style smokebox number plates, although curiously, all but a few of the Super Ds and most LNWR locomotives never received them either under the LMS or BR. Withdrawal of the Super Ds started after nationalisation. All had passed into British Railways ownership. All tank engines built in the 40s were turned out in the mixed traffic livery. This is one of Ivatt's Class II 262 tanks, built in large numbers in the decade to replace the last of the older Midland 044s and LNWR 242s. The latter were by now well overdue for replacement, the youngest being built in 1897, and whilst withdrawal had been going on throughout the LMS period, it was now speeded up. However, 40 remained at nationalisation. Once again, we visit an LMS mainline local station to see the variety of traffic at the end of our period, as the prototype rebuilt Scott, the former Fury, runs through, followed by a Jubilee. The year is 1949, and the location Weedon, a small junction station on the original direct main line avoiding Northampton. The station was the junction for the cross-country line to Daventry, a local for which is the next train seen. The locomotive is one of the Stanier two-cylinder 264 tanks, the last of which was built in 1940, followed by a Black 5 and a D-streamlined Duchess. The latter were known to enthusiasts as semis. The length of these trains is very noticeable in the true LNWR tradition. The Stanier Pacifics had been designed with the intention of hauling 15-coach trains over the 400-mile West Coast main line from Euston to Glasgow. Note the variety in the coaches, including the 12-wheel restroom cars. The LNWR tradition also lives on with the first freight that we see, headed by a Super D, not as old as it looks. Some of the wagons betray pre-grouping origins, as another Super D reverses off the branch with another freight, passing the tall LNWR signal cabin and a number of wagons stored on the siding alongside. The engine bears its BR number, but using the final LMS style of numerals. Some wagons have traces of their original private owners. All such wagons were nationalised after being requisitioned for war use. Two more southbound expresses follow, with a Jubilee on a train of pure Stanier stock, except the last coach. It's followed by a Coronation, whose sloping top smokebox reveals that it's one of the originally streamlined machines. Its train has rather more mixed stock. Another freight trundles past. The nationalisation of the private owner wagon fleet was a major disaster for the railways, because besides taking away its principal freight customers' intrinsic interest in using the railway, it put money into their hands, and they promptly used it to buy road vehicles instead. Another Ivatt Class II tank approaches with a local. These small machines were the final new LMS type to be produced before nationalisation, and were perpetuated by British Railways, at first in their original form, and later as a barely modified standard design. They had a 260 tender equivalent, produced to replace the various types of pre-grouping 060s. North of Rugby once again, a Jubilee approaches with another express. Both this and the following member of the class sport the post-war LMS Express locomotive livery of glossy black with lining of maroon edged in straw, colours also used for the numbers and tender lettering. The expresses are followed by a freight headed by a Stanier Class 5 260. These Moguls were Stanier's first LMS design and were rapidly superseded by the more versatile 460 Class 5, the famous Black 5s. This is another defrocked Coronation. Once they had all been dealt with, they became generally known as Duchesses, or, as previously said, as semis to the enthusiasts. They'd been semi-streamlined. The next freight is headed unusually by a Patriot. This is one of the first two members of the class, distinguished by the large driving wheel bosses inherited from the Claughtons, from which these two had nominally been rebuilt. Two more passenger trains follow, both somewhat shorter than usual. The second is a local or stopper, headed in an exchange of roads with the Patriot, by a stannier Mogul. The latter were usually associated with freight work. An original Scot paired with a Jubilee, followed by a rebuilt Scot in the opposite direction, all still in LMS livery, are to be followed by another coronation. These give a fair representation of the express passenger fleet handed over to British Railways in 1948, an organisation that was to preside over the final chapter in steam development, as the railways inexorably lost their way and their traffic. Some idea of the obsolete working practices and stock acquired by British Railways is seen as a Midland Railway 060 trundles along the slow lines past a rebuilt Scot. Its train is a lengthy mixed freight with a wide selection of wagon types, including some ex-private owner ones. The problems associated with the nationalisation of the private owner wagons didn't really make themselves felt until the end of the decade. By that time, there was a distinct downturn in freight carried by the railways, and passenger traffic was also affected. This was partly a reaction to the war years, when people had had to use the railways, often in run-down and filthy stock, and partly to the growth in road vehicles, again accelerated by the war years. Many people had had to learn to drive, a skill they would want to use afterwards in civilian life. Ex-military vehicles became a cheap source of transport for fledgling businesses. These factors, combined with the dearth of investment funds under nationalisation and the confused state of the railways in the early nationalisation years, led to a very poor public perception of railways, from which they would never fully recover. This original Scot, they were often referred to as parallel boilered Scots to distinguish them from the rebuilds, is heading a fully matching set of late LMS coaches. As with locomotives, British Railways perpetuated the company's coach designs in its first years, not producing its own designs until the next decade. The same occurred with wagons, the short wheelbase four-wheeled wagons devoid of continuous brakes, keeping freight train speeds very uncompetitive. Comparisons can be made with continental railways, where much of the infrastructure and rolling stock had been destroyed in the war. The contrast with British Railways' position could not have been more stark, as the continental railways could start with a clean sheet, backed by sufficient investment funds. They built a brand new modern system for the second half of the 20th century. Britain's railways had not been destroyed, so they retained their 19th century assets, and funds were diverted elsewhere to rebuild those parts of the economy which had been destroyed. A few more scenes of LMS locomotives complete our story of that great railway. The Midland Railway 440s were being replaced by the small Ivatt tanks, even on cross-country routes, such as the Midland and Great Northern, which enabled the LMS influence to reach right across England to the East Anglian coast. This is one of the last survivors of the 3P 440s, which saw out its days on that line. Perhaps it wasn't so surprising that LMS management and techniques had such an influence in the newly nationalised railway, as it had covered most parts of the country. Our final LMS views are at Kenilworth Junction, where the single-track line from Coventry joined the double-track line from Berkswell to Leamington Spa. London North Western influence was still strong, evidenced by the LNWR signals supplemented by LMS standard designs and LNWR signal box here, as well as the LNWR Super D heading from Leamington towards Coventry. The train consists of all-steel mineral wagons, the final standard design of the traditional style which British Railways was introducing in an attempt to rid itself of the private owner wagons. A previous attempt by the Great Western in particular to enlarge the standard 16-ton wagon size in the 1930s had failed to address the problem, and so nationalisation and replacement seemed the only way to eliminate it. Since nationalisation had long been trumpeted, the latter were taken over in an extremely poor state of repair, as the owners saw no reason to spend good money on maintaining them. Finally, another Fowler tank like that seen earlier approaches from Coventry with the local service to Leamington, Daventry and Weedon. A Gresley B-17 in an early BR livery, LNER apple green, backs down at Peterborough in 1949. These were Gresley's three-cylinder 460s for the Great Eastern section, one of whose Claude Hamilton's follows. Gresley died in 1941 in harness and was succeeded by Edward Thompson. Removal of the A4's side skirts was one of the first signs of the new regime, as Thompson set about producing a series of standard designs of his own. Most of these were to be two-cylinder types, as he believed Gresley's three-cylinder conjugated valve layout was too complicated. He rebuilt many Gresley engines, but his rebuilding of the very first of the great A1s, Great Northern, with separate valve gear for each cylinder, was often regarded as an act of spite. However, wartime conditions had proven that simplified maintenance was all important. Midland and Great Northern coaches are seen being shunted by another Class D16 Claude. Most of these 440s had been rebuilt with modern round-top firebox boilers during the 1930s, when Thompson was mechanical engineer for the Great Eastern section at Stratford. A few retained Belpaire fireboxes to the end, however, classified D15. Thompson was succeeded in 1946 by Arthur Peppercorn, best remembered for his A1 Pacifics. This one has a train formed of Gresley articulated stock, originally built for the streamlined expresses in the 30s. These had been stored during the war, but the streamliners were never reinstated, the coaches becoming used as normal stock. Rebuilding of the original A1s, by now reclassified A10, to A3s was completed shortly after nationalisation, the legendary Flying Scotsman being one of the last conversions. No more were converted to Thompson's A1 design, the bulk of the new A1 class being made up of Peppercorn's engines. 49 were delivered over a period of 16 months from August 1948. So all were produced under British Railways control. The first 36 were at first painted in LNER green, with British Railways in full on the tender. And when the class was complete, the Scottish, Eastern and North-Eastern regions, into which the LNER was divided, had no less than 202 Pacifics, more than any other part of British Railways, the A3s being the most numerous. Only the A1s, A3s and A4s were to receive the Express Passenger Blue livery. The continuity of line on the LNER could be traced back through the Great Northern, which had built the station at Peterborough, and through the locomotives produced by Gresley both for that company and the LNER. Integration had come through the production of special classes for sections such as the Great Eastern, which had had running powers to Peterborough, the B-17 460 Sandringhams being a case in point. By the 1940s, the LNER had a very strong identity, which would not be subjugated under British Railways. Even Thompson's designs were very much in the Gresley tradition, although they were rather more angular, as evidenced by this B1 460, his two-cylinder standard 460 type, 410 of which were built, the last few by British Railways. Our final views at Peterborough further this visual line, from the rebuilt Claudes through Gresley's classic mixed-traffic B2s, 184 of which were finally built, and the Peppercorn A1s, a brand new example of which passes, painted in the new blue livery. Thompson also followed Gresley's line in coaching stock, which could also be traced back to Great Northern days. However, it's the locomotives, from the Ivatt passenger tanks and 060 goods engines, that show the foundations, as further witnessed by Gresley's K2 Moguls, originally built for the Great Northern. The Mogul design was progressively enlarged by Gresley, and a series of powerful three-cylinder K4 Moguls was specially produced for use on the West Highland lines. Here we see a Gresley K2 double-heading a North British Glen 440 in the last days of the LNER. From here on, all steam would be operated by British Railways.